I'm going to kick off this afternoon session by welcoming you all back after lunch. I hope you're feeling well nourished, both in your stomachs and your brains after this morning. And before we went off into the breakout sessions this morning, you were given homework to do, which was essentially trying to sketch out where you saw the maritime industry in 12 years' time, in 2030. You were trying to sketch out what kind of progress you thought or you hoped that the industry would have made in terms of decarbonization, digitization, safety, talent, trade, and other issues. And I gather that some of the groups were such great pupils that you actually put your ideas up on the board. Some of you hopefully have the ideas in your head. But what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes is just share some of the discussions you've had and then go back into another breakout group to talk about some of the key themes from this morning. So, not to put anybody on the spot, who would like to kick the session off by talking about some of the key themes or some of the key hopes that you identified on the board this morning, looking ahead to 2030. Who would like to get the teacher's prize, being class SWAT, for sharing what you talked about? Or else I will pick on somebody, at which point everyone looks down the floor immediately. Klaus, why don't I ask you, since you have already been speaking, I believe we have some roving microphones. Do we have the microphones out? Okay. Klaus, why don't you tell us what your group talked about in terms of the key hopes you have for 2030?
Yeah, since I don't have everything in my head, I have a little bit of a photo here. But we had a little bit of a five-pronged approach to it. So one of the starting points we felt was to be able to tell our story. And funnily enough, not surprisingly, we got to the conclusion that we discussed that in 14, 15, and 16, and now we're discussing it again. So how come it is that we, as a shipping industry, will not get even close to getting that prize if we are not better at telling our story than what we are today? So that is sort of telling the untold story of all this goods, global trade not being able to move without the shipping industry. It is the safest, most economic, and most environmentally friendly way to move it. And then as a second layer to achieve that, we felt that the industry has to come better together, and if not by collectively getting everybody on board, I think we have proven the last 100 years that will not be possible, then we will have to get onto some kind of voluntary participation that actually draws on the laggards to join and get the public opinion to put some pressure on those that are not up to what we want to achieve, or whoever they may be. And part of that was, of course, also linked to not going into some kind of name and shame campaign, but at least getting people on board. And then finally, or out of the five, I think we wanted to link the achievements to the Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, if the UN is going to give us a prize, we'll have to document that we have done something good for global economic development, job creations, and that, I think it's Sustainable Development Goal number 8. And we'll have to make progress. By 2030, we will only be on low sulfur fuel, and by 2030, we will have to have concrete examples of decarbonized vessels or engines or propulsion systems that are on the water on a test basis. And finally, we will have improved or proven that shipping is a safe place to work for everybody.
Well,
and there's a few more, but I think my time is up.
That sounds like a great collection of goals. If I was to summarize those, I'd say it's all about communication, better communication, which, by the way, as a journalist, I would echo, because was it not for the fact that I took part in the Copenhagen summit a couple of years ago, I had no idea of half of the things about the maritime industry. So I think you can definitely improve your wider communication. Collaboration, either voluntary or forced or shamed, getting the industry to collaborate more, and then to look more at concrete decarbonization goals and safety as well. Well, that's a good wish list of targets. Anybody else got anything they'd like to either add or detract from? Over here. I was going to say it would be courteous, but it's not compulsory to identify yourself if possible, just because, of course, half of the goal of these meetings is to encourage more networking and collaboration. Can we have another microphone over here, I think? Yeah.
I think, so I'm Paddy Rogers from Euronav. We're a tanker company. And I was in Klaus's group, so this is a bit of a cheat. But I did want to make the point, because I think it's really important, that it's not just a question of belling the cat in terms of having ideas that can't get implemented. The two biggest shifts that we've seen in safety for tankers came as a result of customers getting engaged, so that we had regulation for single to double hull, but it got implemented overnight, well ahead of deadlines, because one day the customers woke up and said, I'm not hiring another single hull ship. Our safety records in spilling oil and in safety and in the environment of accidents, lost time injuries, and total record case frequency for our employees has fallen consistently year on year in the tanker industry, and that's as a result of OCIMF and the oil majors getting together and setting stats and vetting ships, going on board and requiring that as a ticket to trade. So if you can link what Klaus was describing in terms of your record to an open database that's secure, and the coalition of the willing are prepared to post their performance, then you can do it without having to point fingers, but by leadership. And we have the digital description of how we can use different secure databases these days, and we can publicly volunteer to not only show where we are, but how we're getting better. And it will be very difficult for some of our customers, with their strong position on ESG and CSR as major companies, not to choose you if you're going down this really definite path.
That's very interesting. I mean, you're talking basically about using a kind of radical transparency approach to actually both encouraging and enforcing raising of standards. And you raise a very interesting point, because many industry sectors over the last couple of years have been forced to change or tripped up by social media snowballs, by essentially groups campaigning online. I guess the maritime industry hasn't seen that yet, but in many ways, it would do well to look at what's happening in other sectors and think about what the impact of a kind of sudden explosive social media campaign might be, to try and get ahead of that in terms of looking at safety standards and looking at ways to try and, address concerns in advance through that kind of transparency. Can we have the microphone back again?
The Twitter storm that could overwhelm the shipping industry is going to be the ships that died of shame, the ones that install open-loop scrubbers, because I think that when Joe Public takes a view on it, we'll be overwhelmed by the emotional response.
Interesting. I mean, interesting question to ask. You guys are used to navigating storms. How well prepared are all of you for a potential Twitter storm on the issue of scrubbers or anything else? Because, as I say, it's a question worth asking. What are your tactics ready to deal with a sudden Twitter storm?
Moving along. Just to carry Klaus's and Paddy's comments one step further, or to, I think, its logical conclusion. If we had ratings on ships cradle to grave on their sustainability and their safety records, from the design to the building, their life cycle, the fuel consumption, right on through sustainable scrapping, I think, and we forced, as you said, Paddy, have the end users to take notice of this, and they would get pressure from their constituents only to charter the highest rated ships. I think also the life cycle of the ship is important. Ships today are sort of forced to scrap before their logical end of life, just because there's an arbitrary number that someone thinks is really a great number. And then, so the energy used to build a ship or scrap a ship is substantial, and it's a large portion of its carbon footprint. So to have that number carried through its entire life, I think, would be advantageous, and it would reward the folks who do the right thing.
Well, that's a fascinating point, because I was at the UN General Assembly meetings last week in New York. I don't know if any of you were there as well, but there's a lot of talk about ESG, a lot of talk about CSR, a lot of talk about all these wretched acronyms. But what came out loud and clear from the UN meetings is the lack of any index, lack of any consistent way of measuring what people mean by sustainable. And there's a lot of frustration from investors. There's some frustration from some of the companies as well about what people actually mean by this. And this creates all kinds of concerns, not least of which the possibility for so-called greenwashing or confusion or arbitrage on the part of investors and companies. So I guess one question you could ask as an industry is, should the maritime industry be trying to create consistent standards or ways of measuring what it means by sustainability or environmentally conscious ways of doing maritime and shipping? I don't know if anybody's actually tried to moot that yet, but perhaps it's up for the industry to create the kind of ratings that you're talking about to help investors and consumers understand better. Anyway, just an idea to put out there. Any other comments or questions, or anyone else want to volunteer some thoughts? Yes, over there in the back.
Just to add on to the point you just made now, and one of the things in our group that we really discussed is that the industry, I think, has been under a lot of criticism for many years, and from our investors, is the whole concept of transparency, which you know, to my way of thinking, having been involved in a number of public and private boards, really relates to proper governance. And we're seeing for the first time in the last couple of years that several investment banks have determined and are actually publishing a list of the most transparent shipping companies with what they regard are the best governance standards. And it gets into safety, environmental issues, it gets into board composition, diversity, do you have enough true independence on the board? And this year they've advanced that further, and they're actually doing a correlation between the stock performance of the companies that are getting in the higher tier versus those that are in the lower tier. So I think slowly as an industry we're making progress, and I think it's really very, very important if we want to try to be compared and benchmarked against other global industries.
That's a great point, but of course it raises a question, given that a lot of the industry is not actually in the form of publicly listed companies, where you don't have a share price to benchmark or look at, what does that mean for the governance of the industry, and how do you actually deal with both public and private companies, you know, as a group within the industry? How do you enforce common standards? Anyone want to share any thoughts on that? Over here. And over there, yes. Let's go here and then.
Hello, my name's Bryony Worthington. I work for the Environmental Defence Fund. And I just, one of the things that came out in this morning's session was about the need to reinstate multilateralism. And the shipping industry is a brilliant example of that global level of commerce and trade that underpins so much of what we're trying to achieve with the Sustainable Development Goals. It's been the cause of great growth and wealth and redistribution of wealth. And we haven't been able to tell that story, or the shipping industry has been very bad at telling that story. And it is also beneficial because it has a global form of governance in the IMO. And there are very few examples of functioning UN agencies that can help you to set standards and regulate and even raise finance if you need to. And you should be embracing the fact that IMO exists. Many of the people around the room will be able to influence the outcomes in those IMO discussions. And you don't need to reinvent voluntary, very complicated systems if you can work through those regulatory platforms you already have and that already function. They're not perfect. And I know there have been lots of complaints about the sulfur rules, but they've been on the statute book for many years. And it really is just a question of the industry learning to adapt and get in ahead of what's coming rather than just wait till the last moment.
Right. Well, that's a great point. And I know there's certainly many other industry sectors today that would actually like to have these kind of structures in place. Let's go over here and then over here. I can see a number of hands coming up.
Tony Foster, Marine Capital. I think part of the answer is, to your question, is how the industry is funded. So I don't think the distinction is necessarily between public and private. So in our case, for example, we raise almost all our money from institutional pension funds, and their standards are very clear and increasing by the day, and it makes no matter that we're private. In fact, I would say they hold us to higher standards often than would be expected in the public space.
That's a great point. And of course, you know, it's interesting these days that even in America, or especially in America, people are questioning whether public companies are really the best way to organize affairs. Let's go over here and then over there. Unless...
Hi, my name is Doris Ho. Oops. I hope you can understand my voice. But anyway, I'm speaking for our group. And our group agreed that what we want to be awarded for is to be finally recognized as an industry that provides a great service for humanity, one. And number two is that we're a leader in innovation. So Klaus mentioned that over the last 3 years, you've talked about how you get that message across, even messages across on how many companies are really following sustainability indexes and things like that. So what we felt was, maybe what is lacking is the way you fund that money to be able to have a communication plan. And so one idea that we had was to really use the P&I system, because everybody pays to the P&I. So if we use 1% of all premiums paid to the PMI and actually get a fund that is used in two ways. One is to plan a communication plan rolled out very professionally about what we do, about the sustainability goals that we're aiming for, about how we contribute to cleaner oceans and safer seas. The second one would be to use some of the fund to finance research, R&Ds in universities, together with companies like Wärtsilä and some big engine makers, to really contribute to being in front of innovation, of cleaner engines, cleaner sources that are used, like hydrogen and all that. So it makes us be in front of innovation rather than the butt of innovation. And so, but the most important part is where we get the money. But to achieve that for the P&I, every member must tell their own club. We believe we must use a percentage of that, because for all the policy, the costs, fines, penalties, of all the things that we pay for non-compliance comes from our money as well. And so that way it's a very socialized way of collecting that money. Small companies pay, big companies pay accordingly. Thank you.
That's an interesting idea. And I must say, from my perspective, as a journalist, looking at the current moment, in some ways, the rise of Donald Trump has done you all a great favor, because until about 4 or 5 years ago, most people didn't think that much about trade unless you happened to work in the maritime industry, because you just kind of assumed that supply chains were there and you just assumed that trade was happening. And what Donald Trump and the protectionism has done is really force policymakers and voters and even journalists around the world to really think about trade and to realize how important it has been in driving forward growth, and to think a bit more about the logistics of it. I mean, I don't think if you were to do a word search about trade in the last year, I'm quite sure the level of debate has surged, and suddenly things like containers are fascinating, or almost fascinating. More fascinating than they were before. So just a thought to pick up on your point, if you were ever going to try and launch a campaign to explain to the world why trade matters and logistics matter, maybe right now is a good moment to do that. We have another comment over here and then over here.
Thank you, Gillian. Richard Hext. I'm representing here Swires and Anglo-Eastern, where I'm a non-exec director. So I was also part of Randy's group over there, and we were very focused on 2050 in our group. So by 2030, we felt this industry would really need to have made some concrete steps towards reducing emissions by 50%, benchmarked to 2008. So this isn't volume adjusted, this is in absolute terms. So we looked around the group at the Global Maritime Forum here, and we noticed there weren't too many shipyards here. We were a bit disappointed. And we also noticed there weren't too many engine manufacturers. And it did occur to us that engine manufacturers and shipyards might be an important part of making the change necessary if we're going to get close to these targets come 2050. So we thought that the way forward might be for the ICS, which is also represented here somewhere, that represents the ship owners towards the IMO, had to get the shipyards and the engine manufacturers engaged in producing the kit that is going to help us reduce, to meet these 2050 targets.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's a great point. I don't know whether there's any been debate about trying to do a sort of joint session with them at all or anything like that, but that would be a very interesting debating point. There, and we had one and then two. So 1, 2, and then I'll come behind me. I realise I don't mean to ignore you guys over here.
Thank you. Many of the points that we discussed, I'm Ken Sørensen, Group 20. I was very disappointed to see that all our great scratchings had been erased from the board over there. So let me try and remember what we discussed. But I think one of the things we did discuss.
If you were a millennial, you would have taken a Snapchat photograph already.
Yeah, but did we have any in our group? Not.
No. Are there any millennials here?
Certainly not the youngest in the group, but not the oldest, I guess. Anyway, long story short, we did talk about the image of the industry, and I know indirectly that's being discussed here all along. So the headline for us was Green, Clean, Lean, which is basically a 2030 headline when we received the award. We talked about a couple of opportunities. We said, let's get rid of all plastic, and we had a headline saying Nord Oasis picks up the last ton of plastic from the oceans. We also talked about less fatalities. We said 70% reduction in fatalities in the year 2028. So we were very concrete about the actual objectives, because I think that's what it takes. But we started the same place as we just heard here about who's going to fund all this. We took a different approach. We said, and I know that sounds silly, we don't want to talk about it, but we said, we burn fuel, let's put that carbon tax on the fuel. I know that it's a bad word to use in this forum typically, but that's how we need to fund it. Some suggested P&I clubs. I don't think that's a bad idea either, but it hits everyone if we put it onto the fuel, and it ends up hopefully being passed on to the consumer. But it needs funding. The idea of getting shipbuilders involved, I'm sure, is a good idea as well. Yeah. But if we don't take the initiative, nobody else will. So.
That's a good point. Okay, question here, comment here, if you pass it along, then over there, and then I will come over here. So you can't just hide in the back forever.
Deanna MacDonald, I represent Block, and it's actually building on quite a lot of the points here, but our group discussed connecting global supply chains. So transport and logistics is an element in supply chains, and furthermore, who are the stakeholders involved? We have suppliers, producers, consumers, ports, logistics. And generally speaking, it's one thing to put tax on fuel so that the shipping sector changes their ways, and it's another to ask consumers to start paying to transport their goods in a clean manner. But furthermore, how we can connect those supply chains, those global supply chains, and shipping being an element, a major element of them in order to move and facilitate goods in a more simplified fashion. In our end, we went through the kind of process of each of those elements and what we would want from every one of those groups and how we're changing and what our goals are. And then in the end, what we ended up saying is that we create inclusive and sustainable value capturing for global supply chains. And I think that's an element that we don't often consider. We blame the shipping sector for a lot of our problems in transporting goods, but not putting the pressure on those that are ordering these goods or those that are producing these goods. So we spoke a lot about how we could, generally speaking, bring those supply chains together in order to create that value. And I think that's an element that we overlook quite a lot of the time.
That's a great point. Very good point. Got a comment over here towards the back. And then go around there, and then over there, and then we'll sweep over here.
Yeah, hi, Graham Westgarth, Graham Westgarth from Gaslog. The goal that we actually established was to optimize the supply chain through the removal of waste or duplication, which I think is kind of an adjunct to the statement that was just made. And after that, we moved on to world peace, but then we quickly regressed. But I think we thought a little bit about that, and I think the things that you need to be able to achieve that, and I think two principal issues that need to be addressed are a common technological platform, which brings us into the digitization, but also the government support for legislation that enables if you like, the free movement of trade and the elimination of waste. And then we had a dialogue as to why would and should governments actually support something like that? Because I think if you eliminate waste, and Soren Toft gave us a great example by saying that for every time a container ship comes into port, 51% of its time is taken working cargo, 49% is actually waste, it's waiting. So if you can eliminate that, think of the benefits from, if you like, a cost perspective. So the end user becomes receiving things that reduce costs, and from an environmental perspective, to name just two. So that was kind of, how you thought you might be able to move a dialogue like that forward.
Right. Well, what you've certainly seen in so many industries in the last few years is the way that digital technology has knocked out redundancy or waste, or basically made assets sweat a lot harder, whether it's in the car sector with Uber, or in the home sector with things like Airbnb. I mean, the question, I guess, really is whether you can use digital technology to do that. Yes, question there, and then over here.
Actually, not a question. We had a great teamwork, so he took the tough part and I took the easy part. And that is the one that our legacy would be that we made Africa jump generations in terms of supply chain. We took upon us to actually make Africa able to become part of the global community as manufacturers and consumers and so on, without having to worry about archaic and not very efficient supply chains that we currently have. So our legacy here would be that we were the ones that put Africa on the world map in terms of efficient supply chain.
Wow, well, that's a very exciting concept to ponder. Very exciting indeed. And great moment. Comment? Right, over there.
Hi, Amy Jadasimi from Ladol. So we talked about two concepts, automation, which hasn't come up very much yet, but in a much broader sense in terms of automating the whole value chain. So starting from the shipbuilder to the shipper to the terminals, there'd have to be a unified automation system in order to make that really work. And that opens up a lot of other opportunities and a lot of other places in which you can become more efficient, you can become safer, and you can open up different business lines, and you can also localize a lot more. And then Olav in our group, who I can't see right now, had a really good idea linked to automation, which is creating a completely circular value chain. So making completely recyclable vessels, but it also brings in waste management so that you could have 100% circularity in the way shipping was done. And that would also have to involve both the shipbuilder in terms of how you design the ship in the first place so that when you break it down, it's a lot easier to recycle, and the terminal operators, and then localizing the places in which you break down ships and put them back together.
Right. Well, that's, again, another fascinating group of ideas. Raises the question, though, I mean, this theme of automation, which comes up over and over again, and integration, who is going to drive that? Will that be the private sector? Will it be a collaborative effort? I mean, it's an interesting question to think about. I'm curious myself. I'm also curious as to ask you, how do you feel about this goal of putting Africa on the map through shipping?
You want me to answer now? Oh,
yeah.
Okay. I think it's a good idea in the sense that for it to work, it would have to be equitable. So it's less of a, putting Africa there and more of a working with Africa to open up opportunities. I think over lunch, we were talking about creating infrastructure is a great way of doing that. I'm sitting next to the expert, so I'm going to hand it, even though I'm from Nigeria, he's the real expert because he's looked at the data across Africa. So I think it's a good idea, but it has to be done equitably.
So Africa putting itself on the map.
Thank you, Amy. Arthur Minsat, OECD Development Center. So Africa is actually already on the global map. What we see is that 50% of Africa's GDP goes into exports and imports. So it's really on the global map. Now, the issue is the lack of localization and regionalization. Intra-African trade is only 11.9% of the total, whereas trade of Africa with the rest of the world has tripled in the last 10 years. And the issue here is that we mainly have 51% of this trade comes from raw commodities. So the issue for industrialization, for broader well-being in Africa and to have more inclusive growth is to have industrialization, but happening locally, so that more processed, manufactured good can be exported, and by having regional hubs that work together with the maritime industry and to increase Africa's shares into global value chain. Africa's share in global value chain today is about 2.2% of the total, so there's great scope to increase that potential.
Thank you. You certainly have all the statistics at your fingertips. That's fantastic. So thank you. Any other comments or thoughts from over here? Okay, yep, one over here, and then we need a microphone. Yep, over there.
Okay, so a lot of ground covered, but one area we haven't touched upon is the important aspect of people. The people who drive our industry. So a number of aspects here. The first one is around maybe a different type of person, because it's going to be higher tech, higher innovation. And are our seafarers that we currently have, are they going to be the ones for the future? The aspects around gender, all of those areas as well in attracting people into the industry. And then the third area is around the welfare for those people. We touched upon safety, but behind every single incident, there is a welfare care for people issue. And how can we together address that, which will not only improve safety performance, but also motivation, improve efficiency, and improve all aspects of all of the points that we've got on the board. Thank you.
That's great points. How do you persuade software engineers to go to sea if you're going to need all this high-tech IT stuff? I did notice that in your issues monitor, the issue of safety was not, one of the top points of concern right now, which suggests that there has been progress made. I was also very struck that piracy has gone right down, which again, I guess is a source of progress there. But the people issue is certainly very, very important. Right, over in the back here.
Yes, I was with group number 7, and we covered subjects such as the governance issues as well, which was very much a paramount importance to us. We also covered about how to possibly create the fund using the tax levy, and in Hong Kong we've been lobbying for that through the ICS in negotiating with the IMO, that perhaps we can have a percentage of whatever tax is levied on the carbon tax. But one thing to support also the concerns with scrubbers, not only is throwing the waste directly to the ocean a big concern, but also the exposure of all these chemicals to our crew. And with the P&I clubs here, I think it's a very important issue to address on the issue that we may be exposing ourselves to occupational disease claims, which to this day, as a member of one of the clubs, we're still paying for people who had experienced exposure to asbestos 30 years ago, and the amounts that are budgeted are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think this is another issue that we try to do our best to try and satisfy certain requirements from certain charters, but we forget our social responsibilities as well in exposing all our people to these chemicals. And I think that's not our job as ship owners to be cleaning the fuels. Thank you.
Well, that's a good point. And obviously the scrubber issue is a very hot topic. Anyone else want to comment on that? Yes, over here towards the front. And we've only got about another 5 minutes. So if any of you got any themes you want to bring up which we haven't yet touched on, you have about 5 minutes to wave your hand.
So just to add to the scrubber matter, I think it's important that everybody understands that every operator is adjusting the speed based on the fuel price. If the fuel price is expensive, we go slower. So, and if the fuel price is cheap, we go fast. Scrubber is causing ships to go faster. Scrubbers is increasing CO2 and NOx emissions. So I really want Mr. Lim to understand that. People will do whatever they have to do financially, including us. But I think there's too little information about the increasing CO2 and NOx that scrubbers will create.
Right. Well, obviously the fuel prices are going up right now. We have a comment behind.
Not on scrubbers. Angus Frew from BIMCO. We covered a number of the areas that have already been touched on, but one area which we haven't touched on, which is related to standardization and standard systems, open source systems. And there's a lot of really good work going on, a number of projects I'm aware of. And the biggest issue is how those projects are going to be rolled out worldwide. There's the Eventi Pronto project, which is about port-to-port optimization. And that's about how you can sail at a very steady speed from port A to port B and come in, berth, have all the services, and get out within the minimum amount of time. The moment we rush to a port, we anchor up for 3 or 4 days, if not longer. CO2 emissions on some journeys are probably 25% more on that journey than they have to be. Another area is port calls, and there's a huge amount of data that has to be provided to every port. Every port wants this data in a different format. There's a European project that has come up with something that, if rolled out, and it's all to do with open source platforms and standards, but if that were to be rolled out, that would reduce the administrative burden of the bridge team by 80%. Wow. So how are we going to take these projects and roll them out worldwide is, I think, one of the big questions.
Well, that's fascinating. It'll be very nice to see a European initiative go global right now. So maybe that can be one example where it actually does. But we have a comment over here.
Hi, my name is Jack Xu. I'm the chairman of the Hong Kong Shipowners Association. One of the things that I think we haven't pointed out yet is the reality of the multi-fuel world post-2020. And we haven't really discussed actually the level of complexity of the fuel handling system, both onshore in terms of the bunker delivery infrastructure, as well as on board. It represents a very large unknown technical risk in terms of engine failures. And if the shipping industry is carrying 90% of the global trade, and there is going to be some disruption from a risk management perspective, technically, that is something that I think we need to discuss more and try to attain some solution.
No, that's a great point. Yep, over here, we have literally about 3 minutes to go. Isn't quite the Oprah Winfrey sharing session of the maritime industry, but we're getting close, or closer.
I'm Ravi Mehrotra, Chairman Foresight Group. My question is, I have heard everyone, and we are talking only the shipping. Our group's discussions resulted in, we have to look beyond shipping. The planet needs trading. How will we trade without shipping? So the ships are essential. And it is the world trade which has to come and assist how we can clean and care for them in the future. The world, human beings cannot live without trading. So we have to look at the total world. And this is how slowly the shipping, it went to 84%, now back to 88% of the world trade.
Yes.
Because there is no other alternative. So we have to focus more how the world has to come to our help. Thank you.
So how do we keep the world trading? 2 more questions over here, 2 more comments. Over here.
Jesper Kjærgaard, V Group. I think we need to be far more ambitious as an industry. I'm hearing that we want to reduce the sulfur, but how about eliminating sulfur? We should go from high sulfur to low sulfur and ultimately potentially to electric.
I mean, the thesis here must be that we don't want to emit sulfur at the end of the day, and we should go from high sulfur to low sulfur to no sulfur.
Well, that's certainly laying down the gauntlet.
Hi. First of all, I want to say thanks for inviting me to this two-day MBA program. I'm the fuel guy here, and on the sustainability, I went straight to energy, believing that energy is kind of the center of everything. But I got corrected and looked at the 17 issues related to sustainability. And we ended up on the last one. We had a great conversation, and it was really looking at the partnerships. That was the 17th one. So, when you look at trade and you look at, some of the bigger things that we're talking about here in terms of bringing the community together, you've got aviation, which connects, all of the world's people. You've got shipping, and you've got technology. All right, those are the three things that I think really connect the world. So, we looked at basically public-private partnerships in terms of getting, engaged. So when you look at all of this 17 issues related to, gender equality and safety and all that sort of jazz, how do you do all of that? So it's really connecting all of that and really getting individuals engaged with that. How are we going to deal with the whole thing? So that, I think, was interesting, and we're talking about scrubbers now and all that sort of jazz, and whether you like regulations or not, you've got to be proactive. So a single fuel would be certainly pretty interesting. It is going to be pretty complicated. I don't think people appreciate the level of complexity in terms of storage, transportation, handling. People are going to wish their ships look like parcel tankers in terms of their storage, purification, lube systems. So it is going to be a little bit challenging in the future. So I think that proactive engagement certainly is what a lot of what we're talking about, and then bringing the world together. Why can't shipping take on a bigger role in terms of bringing the world together? You don't think about shipping. You don't travel on ships. Anyway, and then the legacy was using the traditions of the sea to lead a global community.
Right. Comment over here, and we're almost out of time, but if anyone else has got any burning issues we've not yet spoken, so let's have one comment here, one comment there, or in fact, lots of hands waving now. Are we okay to go 5 minutes over? Okay. I want to get these 3 comments here.
Thank you. My name is Temi Okesanjo. I'm from the Nigeria LNG Ship Management Limited. And I just want to comment on how to put Africa on the maritime global map. It's so simple because when you look at some of the write-offs that you have on the board there, the greatest potential that you have in Africa going towards 2050 is manpower. You see the population rising, and you're able to ask yourself, how can we tap into this potential? And an example has been set within the context of collaboration that exists amongst big companies. Like my own company is set up by Nigeria National Petroleum Corporation, Shell, ENI, and Ajib. And this company has been able to transform the Nigerian maritime industry to the extent that today you have an outfit that have trained over 2,000 maritime manpower. It's managing ships, it's running terminal, and is able to even go to the international finance market and raise loan for the building and construction of LNG carriers. So there's a potential where collaboration and resilience exist. And I think this is where you can easily put Africa on the global map, if well-resourced. Thank you.
Well, that's a very cheering comment. So we have a comment over here, and then over here, I think.
In our group, we also talked about technology and also what we raised also, the role of millennials. If you look into Asia or ASEAN in particular, or even China, most of the companies now are run by millennials, okay? And for the millennials, Internet of Things is their world. So the change about payment system in Asia is very much standardized. Port management is also standardized. So those issues are not really a problem in Asia. So the market is in Asia. So I can see that the driving force would come from this area. So we hope that it could then influence the changes, the technology that's available in the Western world. The collaboration between the two would really expedite the change that is being worried here by the current baby boomer generation.
Right.
That's my sort of comment.
Okay. Is anybody in the room a millennial? Anybody want to admit to it? We have one, one, two, three, four. Do any of the millennials want to comment on this at all? If not, we'll go to a comment over here. But I think you make a very good point about the changing issue of millennials.
I'm not a millennial. There was a phrase that came up in 2 points of our group, and that was the sharing of knowledge. First of all, from a safety perspective, it's a well-coined phrase, but black box thinking, sort of feeding back safety reports and knowledge back to the industry so the industry can do something about safety and taking safety forward. We don't think there was a platform that enabled that. And also, we obviously talked about decarbonisation, the reduction of greenhouse gases. I think there are a lot of technologies in the industry already, but nobody's sharing that information. So I think there needs to be a platform or a forum for people to bring solutions to the table and share those solutions, because we could probably get there a lot faster than doing it individually in a very fragmented market.
Right, we are throwing down the gauntlet again to the organisers of this group, because if you do need an industry body to act as a kind of clearinghouse for information about safety, provide radical transparency and sharing technological solutions, certainly this, I would presume, would be one such body where you can develop that kind of collaboration. So maybe in terms of your tangible to-do list at the end of the meeting, that could be something on the agenda.